Clinker Factor, the cement industry podcast.
Welcome to the Clinker Factor, a podcast from WCA, which looks at the cement industry's response to climate change around the world and other topics of interest. I'm Ian Riley, CEO of WCA, and your host on the Clinker Factor. Today we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk to Manon Burbidge, who is our Communications and Policy Manager, about COP26. So Manon and I went to Glasgow to participate in COP26 since the cement industry is a significant emitter, and the way in which we decarbonize is going to have a big impact on the industry's future. So I was happy that we saw some of our other members there, Dalmia Cement, Blue Planet, A Cube Cement, and the Smart Surfaces Coalition. Before we went up to COP, we issued a press release and calling on governments to act and to help the cement industry to take action on the climate. And in particular, we want the governments to promote a market for low carbon concrete and in particular to use low carbon concrete in their own procurement, to create incentives in terms of carbon pricing and help remove some of the roadblocks in introducing low carbon products in the product standards. So I think what came out of COP was quite encouraging. And not only the primary agreement, the main agreement at COP, but also the fact that there were side agreements on other important topics like coal and deforestation and methane. The second thing I think was encouraging was to see the extent to which businesses were participating. So both industrial companies and a lot of finance representatives. A third aspect was just in the mechanisms that were set up to review on an annual basis their NDCs on. So all of that seemed quite encouraging, even though some people were disappointed about the central agreement. Manon, the event that we attended was the SIF. Maybe you'd like to introduce that.
Yes, so the Sustainable Innovation Forum was a 3-day side event that was run alongside the Blue Zone and the Green Zone at COP26. And for those who don't know what that is, the Blue Zone is where the government negotiations take place primarily, and the Green Zone is a more civil society exhibition event. So the Sustainable Innovation Forum was run by the WCA climate partner, Climate Action, which is an events organisation that run conferences in the climate and sustainability space. And we were invited along to that event as institutional partners. And also Ian was invited to speak on a panel called Deep Decarbonisation for the Big Emitters, alongside the World Gold Council, Enviva, Roland Berger and Herbert Smith Freehills. So Ian, maybe you want to take us through some of the key themes that you talked about on that panel and what our listeners can take away from it.
Well, the panel gave me a chance to reiterate the topics that we covered in the call to action for governments, and to explain a little bit about where the cement industry is and the history of working on emission reductions in the cement industry. We also talked a little bit about how people saw the shape that the COP agreement was taking. But I think it does also illustrate one of the challenges of these events that go on for such a long time, in that I think one of the things that happens after a while is that the differences between the situation in different industries, it's hard to get people to really pay attention to that. And there's kind of a acclimatization to a message, and I think people pay less attention at the end of one of these events than at the beginning. So we did our best to try to make it a little bit different, a little bit interesting. I'm not sure if we succeeded in doing that. Perhaps as one of the spectators, you could tell me, or one of the audience, you could tell me whether or not we did.
I think that it was an interesting panel. You covered some good topics, and if anyone's interested in going back and listening to the discussion that took place, you can register on the Climate Action website. They're available for the next year, I believe, so you can go and find out for yourself if it was worthwhile.
Good. And so I think another thing we heard a lot more about at this COP, going back to the WCA conference in October, was climate justice. I really take that to mean two things. So one is that developed countries are going to have to provide some financial assistance to developing countries for their decarbonization efforts. And the second thing is the concept that the developing countries will go at a different pace depending on their situations. And I guess this is a theme that we're going to see running into the next two COPs in Egypt and the UAE, where this topic of climate justice and compensation for past emissions is going to probably be more to the forefront than it was in Glasgow.
And also how we hold developed nations accountable for the payments that they commit to, and how we get those flows of finance moving to developing countries will be really interesting. Something I thought about as well that was interesting that came out of COP was the emphasis on resilience to the changing climate and adaptation, and how we can help developing countries adapt, because it's no good, if a country has an extreme weather event and houses and businesses and economies get knocked flat and they build it up, and then the next year an event comes back and it's worse, and then they have to go down and start from scratch each time. And it got me thinking about how the cement and concrete industry could contribute to alleviating some of those issues with regards to building better and more resilient infrastructure. So I don't know whether you've had any thoughts on that, Ian.
Yes, I think you're right. I think when we talk about these payments from developed countries to developing countries, then a lot of that may well be directed towards adaptation rather than mitigation. And clearly, we're at a 1.1, 1.2 degree increase already, and we're already seeing climate events that are more serious than in the past. The prognosis for the next 10 years is that that's just going to get worse. So I think there will be more and more pressure to try to find ways to help developing countries adapt.
I mean, in the whole of human history, the Earth's climate has never fluctuated by more than a degree. So we're already beyond the realms of what humans have ever had to deal with. So even 1.5 is an unknown picture, let alone 2 or 3 degrees. So there's a real impetus to act and act now. Did you see much of that urgency come out of COP?
I think there was a sense of urgency, and I think if you look at some of the announcements that have been made by companies in the last few months, there has been more said about what needs to happen in the next 10 years. It's not just about net zero in 2050, which is for most companies several CEOs away. It's about what needs to happen now. So I do think that we are seeing a greater focus on the immediate future, but clearly there isn't enough urgency yet on the part of either governments or companies to meet the 1.5 degrees C goal. I think even if everybody implements the not just the commitments but also the policies that they've talked about, it's still something around 1.8.
I think it might even be as high as 3 degrees.
The commitments to date, I think, are about that 3 degrees. But I think if you factor in things that have been said but not yet formally committed to, then you can, with an optimistic view of that, you can get down to about 1.8. So as you say, a range of something like 1.8 to 3 is the sort of outcome from COP26, which is less than where we were 5 years ago, but it clearly is still well above 1.5.
And something that struck me that came out of a lot of the presentations at the Sustainable Innovation Forum was the need for the private sector to act and the capacity that the private sector has to act. I think there was a figure like 70% of financial decisions across the world are taken by private sector organizations. So, there's a lot of scope for companies to take action. And a quote that stuck with me really was, "We need to stop waiting around and using a lack of policy from governments as an excuse. We should be doing things ourselves." How much do you think that the cement industry can sort of take that and use that for action?
Well, the critical role that government has is in setting incentives and making sure incentives push the right kind of behavior. So if you have a situation where it's free to throw things away, and whether that's CO2 or solid waste or whatever, then you will get that behavior. You know, people will throw things away. If you have a situation where there's a price to throwing things away, as for example in the UK, there's a cost of nearly £100 a ton for landfilling construction waste. So that's a big incentive to recycle it in some way. So you can see that industry will respond to incentives, but if the incentives are not changed, then we'll continue to get the same behavior as we've had in the past. So it really does, it's all very well saying we shouldn't wait for governments. And I think that works fine for many industries where the cost of carbon mitigation is not very significant. But when you talk about the hard to abate sectors like cement and steel, then it's not possible to compete today if you're spending what you would need to spend on carbon capture and storage to get down to a zero carbon cement. So it really comes down to how a government's going to create an environment that will allow everybody to do what they know is necessary.
So you think for the cement industry specifically, the action needs to come first from the government?
Well, I think the cement industry has been taking action for the last 20 or so years, but the action is within the competitive framework that exists. So the energy efficiency and this sort of thing has, moving to alternative fuels has some return. And so it incentivizes the companies to make changes which both reduce costs and reduce carbon emissions. But we know that to get to zero carbon is a big step. And the only technology we have today is carbon capture and storage, which is extremely expensive. But even allowing for that coming down in price over the next 10 years as it becomes scaled, then a cement company that voluntarily did that in the current environment, within the current set of incentives, would go out of business. You know, so it depends on the industry. For some industries, it's possible to act without government changing the incentives. But when it comes to the hard to abate, there needs to be some level playing field. If some companies can continue to take no action, and the companies that take action are at a very significant competitive disadvantage, then clearly that doesn't work.
At the WCA conference, one speaker mentioned that when it comes to climate change, we should put aside competition and instead collaborate. And so to what extent do you think that the cement industry can collaborate to reach net zero and to reach the levels of emissions reductions that we really need to start seeing?
Yeah, so collaboration was a theme, as you quite rightly say, was a theme that came up a lot in the COP events, and quite rightly so. So I think there's two, for the cement industry, certainly there's two types of collaboration. One is a cross-industry collaboration, where we can learn from what other industries are doing or have done. And then the other is collaboration along the supply chain, which allows the optimization of carbon footprint based on what we know now and how we can operate now. And that's starting to happen. We're starting to see project owners being willing at a very early stage in the project to engage with material suppliers as well as contractors and specifiers and architects to figure out how to reduce the carbon footprint of the building or the infrastructure that they want to build. So we start to see this cooperation along the supply chain, and there's a lot of mileage in that for the cement and concrete industry to reduce the demand for the quantity of cement or the quantity of clinker in particular that we are producing, but at the same time to satisfy the requirement for concrete. So it'll be a challenge, I think, for all of the players because it's something new. But there's clearly potential, and a number of the recently published roadmaps identify that potential.
And we see a good example that came out of COP of governments collaborating through the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative, which saw the UK, the UAE, India, Germany, and Canada supporting low carbon concrete and steel in major public construction projects. So what can we sort of expect to see from initiatives like that? And what does that mean for the industry? Yes,
I think this is it's a very big step forward. Governments around the world buy a very significant portion of concrete. Somewhere between a third and a half of concrete is purchased by government or government bodies. And if those government bodies start to prefer low carbon concrete, then we'll see quite a strong market driver to produce concrete or to find ways to reduce the carbon footprint of concrete. So we're seeing that already to a limited extent in the UK, certainly with some of the government projects, HS2, and some of the flood control projects that the Environment Agency is doing. And we also see it with private developers. Or, for example, in California, it's something that has been mentioned by a number of the concrete companies that we've talked to that operate there, US Concrete and Azinga, for example, in terms of the demands from technology companies when they're building new offices. So we do start to see some examples of the end users demanding lower carbon solutions. And I think that market driver is clearly one of the ways in which the government can support changes and encourage companies to move in the right way.
And what more can industry organizations that have a global reach, like the World Cement Association, do in terms of collaboration to bring companies together to create really positive solutions and ambitions for net zero? Because we have companies all over the world, so there's different regional contexts, there's companies of different sizes. How do we really get those together and sort of unite them in a common goal?
So in addition to the cross-industry and supply chain collaboration and encouraging that collaboration, one of the things that we can and that we do is to help the members in different parts of the world to learn from best practices in other areas. And I think this will be particularly useful in the case of new technologies. So we already in the Pegasus benchmarking project have included measuring emissions and comparing emissions and looking at the practices that lead to low emissions. So this is one concrete way in which we can help members to figure out what they can do. The other thing is that we're developing a methodology, hopefully at some stage a tool, but anyway, at this point, a methodology that can be applied at the plant level so that cement companies can figure out for their plant, what should their priorities be in terms of decarbonization. And this will be looking at what are the government policies, what is the availability of materials, what are the local factors, and the purpose of the methodology is to allow each plant to set its own pathway to decarbonization, taking account of the local factors, including government policy and the timing expectations that government places on them. So those will be a couple of things that we can do. And as you know, it's something that we spend a good deal of our time thinking about and trying to find new ways that we can help the industry move forward.
So really, if we were to summarize COP26 and what it means for the cement industry, we would say that collaboration is key, that we need governments to come together to create favourable market conditions and create policy incentives that would allow low carbon concretes to enter the market. And we need regional and context-specific solutions that have a common objective to reducing emissions to net zero. Is there anything that you would add to that?
I think you've captured it very nicely, man, and perhaps that's a great place to wrap up. So thank you for chatting to me today, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you.